The Interloper. Written and narrated by ButterflyCoffee and produced for audio by Mr. Judge. He woke to the sensation of harsh, scurried scratching at his tanks. It was uncomfortable and it kind of hurt. He could hear hushed voices as he came to, and when he opened his eyes, he could see chips of coloured paint in his peripheral vision. He looked around in bewilderment. Where on earth was he? This didn't look like any station he'd seen before. It had a different kind of feel to it, he just couldn't figure out what. He saw an engine pull into one of the main platforms ahead of him, and it finally hit home. He gawked at the letters on its tender. G-W-R.
Oh dear.
War was only a week old at Newton Abbot, but everything was moving with a frenzied energy. Engines were starting to be prepped for what was to come, and companies were beginning to divert production to items to help the war effort. People were still being evacuated to the country, and were still trying to come to terms with how badly things had turned out. Everyone felt angry and scared. Morale was low. Now that war was here, nobody knew what to expect. Caitlyn was bustling about the station, backing away from another train and watching it depart. She wheezed loudly. How is it still so busy in the mornings? Before she could answer her own question, Mr. Turner strolled up to her.
Good morning, 476. Caitlyn.
He said, clearing his throat. The Jinty smiled at her new name. Good morning, sir. A name of her own. That was still something she needed to get used to.
There's a stored locomotive in the bay platform which I'd like you to bring round to the yard. It needs to be prepped for work. Hercule can manage here for the time being.
Caitlyn whistled and set off through platform 2 to the bay platform. A bay platform is a stretch of track that serves a branch line but terminates at a mainline station. It does not need to be long, but it must be able to accommodate both engine and coaches. Newton Abbot's bay platform served Louise's branch line, but it has a siding running next to it, and this is where the engine in question stood. Caitlyn looked at it as she ran up to cross over the points. It had black paint and 6 wheels like she did, but it had outside cylinders. The top of its water tanks were curved, and it had huge blocks on its front and back buffer beams. Caitlyn had never seen buffers like those before. Were they even buffers at all? As she came back down, she heard the engine mumbling behind her. She could only hear it properly when her buffers clunked into its own. It squawked in shock.
Wait, a Midlander too? Good grief, they're everywhere!
Caitlyn was taken aback. She had enough of this from Lizzie already. But that tone of voice didn't sound angry. It sounded worried. The Jinty tried to be friendly. It's okay, she said. I'm not going to hurt you.
Much?
At all.
Why?
Caitlyn was a little lost for words. She struggled to come up with a good answer. I don't know, she replied at last. It doesn't feel right. The two were quiet as Caitlyn brought the engine over to the yards. Why did he think she was going to hurt him? She wouldn't want to hurt anybody. Maybe this engine was scared by the war too? She certainly knew she was. After Mr. Turner stepped onto her footplate, Caitlyn brought the shedmaster and the tank engine over to the sheds. Everyone but Hercule was there, and they all looked very subdued. Caitlyn felt her spirits sink a little lower when she saw their faces. But everyone looked up as the Jinty was brought to a halt, uncoupled, and backed away from the engine behind her. Well, what on earth do you have there, Midlander? Sniffed Louise, sounding like her usual haughty self. Caitlyn looked across to the tank engine. It seemed like she wasn't the only one who was a little upset by that comment. Mr. Turner came down from her cab and spoke to address his engines.
This is 6719. I'm an industrial.
Poor Caitlyn almost jumped off the rails, and everyone looked at the tank engine in confusion. He himself looked a little bewildered. Apparently that came out louder than he wanted. He tried again, seeming a little harried and bothered.
Oh dear. I'm sorry, sir. I wanted to introduce myself, sir. I'm 6719. I'm an industrial tank engine. I've just been transferred here from Falmouth Docks.
Mr. Turner stared at this new engine in a hard manner. 6719 felt uncomfortable.
I do not appreciate being cut off, 6719. But since you've already beaten me to it, I've no need to be here now. You shall be steamed and be ready for work immediately. In that time, you may as well acquaint yourself.
The shedmaster strode away to his office.
Yes, sir. Understood.
6719's apology fell on deaf ears, and he was left to fend off his new shedmates, who were curiously eyeing him up. An industrial, you say? Louise scoffed. No wonder the grubby little thing looks so shell-shocked. Shut up, Louise! It must be his first outing away from that dismal little siding he calls an industrial railway. Well, mind you keep out of the way of us mainline engines, won't you? Except, Louise, you are not a mainline engine. Mind your own station for a change. Duchess's warning was quick to shut Louise up, as was Lizzie staring daggers at her. The 2P looked 6719 up and down. These Western and Midland engines really liked to stare at newcomers, didn't they? The tank engine felt a lot smaller than he already was. Tell me, 6719, were you built recently? The sloppiness of your paintwork leaves a lot to be desired. 6719 stammered again.
Oh, you know how it is. Industrial lines are all work and no show, with shoddy coats of paint to boot.
You say you were transferred from Falmouth? That's still remarkably southern. Duchess spoke in a cool voice that seemed to show very little emotion. I would have thought they'd have had higher standards than that.
Not really. The company was responsible for the repaint. I was just lucky to have one when I got one.
Mouthy for an industrial, aren't you? Lizzie's low grunt made 6719 look down at his buffers and go quiet. Caitlyn watched the whole exchange in a confused awe. Still, a locomotive is a locomotive, Duchess said smartly. Let us get to work. The engines all began to make their way to the station, except for Caitlyn, who shunted 6719 onto a siding out of the way so his fire could be lit. As the day drew on, she couldn't help but reflect back on what she'd seen. Duchess had never seemed so cold and collected before. She always spoke so warmly and had a graceful air about her. For the passenger locomotive of all engines to almost completely shut down like that. She'd never done that when Caitlyn first arrived, so why now? I just don't get it, she said aloud. Don't get what? Caitlyn looked across the platform to see Louise pulling in with one of her trains. The autotank spoke bemusedly. What are you wittering on about over there? Speak up! I was just wondering to myself, why did Duchess act like that? It's not like her. Don't say such ridiculous things, Louise replied. Duchess was well within her boundaries to speak to the industrial like that. That's how it all works, you know. Caitlyn frowned. How what works? The hierarchy, of course! Hierarchy? Louise gave a dramatic roll of her eyes and let off steam. Since I've tolerated your presence here for this long, she sighed, I suppose I may as well indulge you, Midlander. Caitlyn frowned at the ballast. She had a name now, for Fowler's sake. You see, there is a well-established yet unsung social pecking order when it comes to locomotives, the 1400 began. We begin with express passengers. They're the cream of the crop, and you dare not speak out against them. They're incredibly important engines and have a reputation to maintain. Then we have express freight. They aren't nearly as glamorous, but they still serve a vital role to the network, transporting their goods about. Then come the standard passenger engines, such as myself, and goods. Again, passengers outweigh goods in importance, and the engines running those trains are highly valuable. After this follows commuter and branch line engines, which simply teeter-totter up and down their little lines. This isn't a branch line engine, though, Caitlyn thought to herself. And then you have the shunters, such as yourself, who hurry around and organise our trains for us and keep the station in good running order. 6719 whistled in the distance. Louise took a small breath and exhaled sharply through her nose. And finally, you have those things, Louise sneered. Industrials. She spoke as though she'd taken on some foul water that morning. The proletariat, by a very long stretch. They're badly built, badly maintained, and have absolutely no manners. All they are worth is moving material from one side of some grubby little mine to the other. In short, they are nothing but disposable, and no respectable engine would even think of associating with them. Be a smart Midlander and heed my advice, won't you?
Louise, no engine is that bloody daft to take any notice of what you tell them to. Go on, clear off!
Caitlyn chuckled at Hercule's taunt, and heard Louise's indignant spotters behind her as she was called away to do some shunting. As she approached Hackney Yards, she saw 6719 buffer up to a line of wagons, complete with brake van. He must be taking that back down to a platform for Lizzie's pickup goods, she thought to herself. But as Caitlyn got closer, she thought she could hear 6719 mumbling to himself. Without thinking, she shut off enough steam so she could hear him.
So this is a Westerners brake van. Bit daft having the cab at one end. Oh well, each to their own, I suppose.
Caitlyn jumped as 6719 suddenly shut off and watched him go, the wagons clattering on the joints in the rails. She knew by now that Louise said quite a lot of things that were not very useful. But if 6719 was an industrial engine that shouldn't be worth more than dismal grunt work, how come he was talking about the design of a brake van? If industrials were grubby engines who knew no manners, they shouldn't know things like that, right? It certainly seems strange. But then again, Louise's advice was never really very useful. Caitlyn would have to puzzle this one out on her own. She was still in thought that evening when someone backed down alongside her. "Hello, 4760 little tyke," chirped the familiar voice. Caitlyn looked up and smiled. "Hello, Julie." The Black Five looked kindly down at the little tank engine. "How are you all holding up down here? Is everyone okay?" "Did you hear? Great Britain is at war with Germany." "I know," Julie responded. "That's why I tried to get back down here as quickly as possible. Although," she added slyly, "the grumpy old birdie told me that someone got their name. Congratulations!" Caitlyn beamed with pride. "Thank you," she puffed. "I'm Caitlyn now." "Nice to meet you," Julie laughed. She quickly settled and asked again if everyone was okay. The Jinty responded with a will, pouring out everything from the week gone by to the goods engine. Julie listened with interest, and was quick to dismiss Louise's rambling about pecking orders. "She's right in some regards, but she does love to lather everything with her own smug sense of superiority," Julie said. "Not every engine can be put into such set roles. I mean, I was built a goods engine, but I find myself taking passenger trains on occasion." The two engines heard a sharp hiss of steam and a hurried clacking of wheels. They looked out to the points leading to the sheds to see Lizzie warding off 6719, sending him scurrying into a siding next to them. As he disappeared behind a wall, Julie looked back to Caitlyn. "Seems like there's a new face around here," she mused.
"That's 6719. He's an industrial engine that's come from Falmouth."
Julie frowned a little. "An industrial engine?" she asked. "Most of the industrials I've seen don't have those big blocky buffers." This is a conundrum," she mumbled to herself. "I've seen engines like 6719 somewhere before. It escapes me now, but I can't remember if I recall or know of any of his class working in mines or collieries. They might have done."
"He also said something funny earlier," Caitlyn added. "He was making some kind of comment about a brake van. I think it was about its design. Do industrial engines know about things like that?"
"I wouldn't have thought so." Julie looked equally confused. Industrial engines are very sheltered. They haven't experienced very much outside of their own railway or mine, and only very rarely deal with any kind of outside rolling stock. Did 6719 sound like he knew what he was talking about?
"Yes, he did," answered Caitlyn. "He was almost confident."
Very strange indeed." Julie trailed off and didn't say anything else after that. Caitlyn wasn't sure what to make of the whole situation. It certainly sounded like things weren't adding up, and she wasn't able to make out what made sense and what didn't. She didn't have long to think before sleep overtook her, and she wouldn't have much longer until she began facing some of the scariest things an engine could be asked to face. 6719 stood quietly behind the left-hand wall of the sheds. He wasn't sure what to make of this place, but he'd have all the time in the world to see the worst and the best of what this new station had to offer him.